The Graham Norton Show has seen everything. Tears, confessions, chaos, celebrities so drunk they fell off the red sofa, proposals, breakdowns, reunions nobody saw coming. In 25 years of Friday night television, that red sofa has absorbed more raw human drama than most therapy offices. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared that studio audience for what happened the night Helen Mirren and Prince Harry sat down together. Because by the time it was over, a man who had spent years presenting himself as a victim had been quietly, methodically, and completely dismantled. Not by a journalist, not by a palace insider, not by a politician with an agenda, but by an 80-year-old woman with an Oscar, a damehood, and 50 years of earned authority, who simply decided she had nothing left to lose. The audience didn't breathe for 6 straight minutes. Harry didn't have an answer for a single question that mattered. And the clip that followed, shared millions of times before morning, became the moment that Britain finally said out loud what it had been thinking for years. Stay with us, because what happened on that red sofa wasn't just television, it was a reckoning. Setting the scene. Let's establish exactly what we're dealing with here, because context is everything. The Graham Norton Show is not a debate program. It is not a courtroom. It is not a political panel. It is Friday night television, warm, slightly boozy, designed to be easy viewing after a long week. The red sofa is famous specifically because it makes uncomfortable things feel comfortable. Graham Norton has built his entire career on diffusing tension with charm. What happened this particular Friday night was the one thing Graham Norton could not diffuse. Helen Mirren was booked to discuss the BBC's Queen Elizabeth Centenary documentary, a project that had consumed months of her attention and carried obvious personal weight. This is a woman who won an Oscar playing Elizabeth II in The Queen, who spent years immersed in the character for The Crown, who has talked publicly about how studying Elizabeth transformed her understanding of duty, sacrifice, and what it actually means to serve something larger than yourself. She did not arrive as a royal commentator. She arrived as an actress who had done the work. Harry arrived separately. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, the man who had sat across from Oprah and described his family as racist, who had done a Netflix documentary with his wife, who had published a memoir, Spare, detailing private family conversations, medical procedures, and intimate royal dynamics, who had spoken on podcasts about his own mental health, his resentment toward the press, his estrangement from his father and brother, his reasons for leaving. 2 other guests rounded out the sofa, a comedian, a musician. You won't hear much about them tonight, because from the moment Helen Mirren and Prince Harry exchanged their first glance across that red sofa, every other person in that studio became a witness rather than a participant. Graham made a joke in his opening, something light, something designed to signal that this was just another episode. He was wrong, and somewhere in the back of his mind, as he watched Helen settle into the sofa with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided what she's going to say, I think he knew he was wrong. The first exchange, and the line that changed everything. Graham turned to Helen first. The documentary, the Queen's centenary. What had pulled her back to this subject after so many years? Her answer was warm and measured. Elizabeth would have been 100 this year. A century of life, 70 of it spent in service. She spoke about what she'd learned through years of study, that duty is not a burden for everyone, that for some people, service is not something imposed on them. It is who they are. I came to understand, Helen said, that Elizabeth woke up every morning knowing her life wasn't entirely her own, that her personal preferences, her private feelings, her individual desires all came second. Not because she was forced, because she chose, because she believed in something larger than herself. Across the sofa, Harry shifted slightly. Graham, sensing the temperature, turned to Harry. He asked something gentle, something about the centenary, about his memories of his grandmother. And Harry, to his credit, said something kind. He talked about her warmth, her humor, her steadiness. But then, and this is where it begins, he added something he perhaps should not have added. He said that he hoped people would also remember how the institution she represented could make those within it feel trapped. That service, from the inside, can look very different than it looks from the outside. Helen turned toward him, slowly, calmly. Can it? I've spent years studying that institution from the outside. Decades reading, researching, trying to understand its weight. What I found was complexity. I didn't find cruelty. Harry replied carefully. You studied it. I lived it. And Helen, without a moment's pause, said, For how long? 2 words. That's all it took. 2 words delivered without heat or aggression, in a perfectly conversational tone. But the studio felt them, because what Helen had done in those 2 words was something precise and devastating. She had not attacked Harry. She had simply asked him to examine the scope of his own experience relative to the claim he was making. You lived it. For how long? Because duration matters. Depth matters. 3 years of participation versus decades of study might offer different perspectives, but they do not automatically deliver superior authority. Harry said he'd been inside it his entire life. Helen nodded. You grew up within it, but you spent most of your adult life trying to leave it. That's a different thing from living it. Elizabeth spent every day of her life trying to serve it. There's a difference between inhabiting an institution and dedicating yourself to one. The comedian on the sofa laughed nervously. Nobody else did. The platform question, and the answer that backfired. Now here is where the conversation turned from uncomfortable to genuinely historic. Because Graham, to his credit, tried to pivot. He asked Helen about a specific scene in the documentary. He tried to guide the conversation back to safe territory. Helen declined the pivot, politely but unmistakably. Before we move on, she said, I'd like to ask Harry something directly, if that's all right. Graham looked at his cards, looked at Harry, looked at Helen. Of course. Helen turned to face Harry fully, and she asked the question that had been sitting in living rooms across Britain for years, waiting for someone with enough standing to finally voice it. The institution you describe as damaging, it gave you a global platform. It gave you a title. It gave you access to rooms, to resources, to recognition that most people spend entire careers trying to earn. How do you reconcile criticizing something you still benefit from? Harry said he had built his own platform since leaving. Think about what he just said. Really think about it. Because in one sentence, Harry had handed Helen Mirren exactly the thread she needed to unravel his entire argument. Have you? She asked. Just those 2 words again. That quiet, relentless precision. The Netflix deal, the book deal, the speaking engagements, the podcast, the foundation. Every door that has opened for you since leaving, would it have opened for Harry Windsor? Or did it open for the Duke of Sussex? Strip away the royal connection entirely. Strip away the title, the story, the access that came from birth and marriage into that institution. What remains that you built independently? The studio held completely still. Because here's the thing, and this is the question you need to ask yourself if you're watching this honestly. Can you answer it? Can you point to a single significant platform, deal, or opportunity that Harry has accessed since leaving that would have been available to him without the royal story? Harry said his mental health advocacy stood on its own merits. Helen said, does it? Or does it have the audience it has because you are the son of the King of England? The silence that followed was not a comfortable pause. It was the silence of a room full of people who knew the answer and were waiting for someone else to say it first. The receipts. Helen goes deeper. Now, most interviewers, most people in polite public life, would have stopped there, would have accepted the silence as its own answer and moved on to something lighter, would have calculated that they had made their point and further pressure would seem cruel. Helen Mirren is not most people. She pressed forward, quietly, methodically, with the patience of someone who has prepared every word in advance. The Archewell Foundation, Harry's charitable organization, the centerpiece of what he describes as his independent post-royal contribution. I looked, Helen said, beautiful website, inspiring language, mission statements that read wonderfully. But when I searched for outcomes, specific, verifiable, measurable outcomes, lives changed, policies influenced, communities affected, I found very little. What has Archewell actually produced? This, right here, is the moment the studio stopped being uncomfortable and started being genuinely stunned. Because Helen Mirren had just done the thing that polite celebrity television never does. She had asked for the receipts, calmly, specifically, and with the precision of someone who had actually done the research before sitting down. Harry said the foundation was still growing. After several years, Helen replied. The Queen's charities produced documented outcomes for decades. The Prince's Trust, your father's foundation, built from the ground up, has helped over 1 million young people find employment. The comparison is not favorable. Harry said comparing his foundation to institutions built over decades was unfair. Then don't compare your sacrifice to theirs, Helen replied. You cannot simultaneously claim the legacy when it suits you and reject the comparison when it doesn't. Now pause on that for a second, because that's not a cruel observation. That is a simple application of intellectual consistency. You cannot use the monarchy's weight and history to amplify your voice while simultaneously refusing to be measured against the monarchy's weight and history. And what was Harry's response? He said he wouldn't be lectured by someone who played his grandmother in a movie. Remember that line, because what he said next made it worse. The moment that stopped the room. Helen's response was delivered without a single raised note. Flat. Even. Devastating. An actress who won an Oscar playing the grandmother you criticize constantly in interviews. An actress who studied your family history more thoroughly than you appear to have understood it. An actress who earned her title through 50 years of documented work, not through the accident of birth. The audience made a sound that wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite a gasp. It was something in between. The involuntary sound of people who have just witnessed impact. But Helen wasn't finished. She raised the matter of family events Harry had not attended. Reports of Harry increasingly absent from gatherings where other royals appeared. Reports, from multiple sources, of the broader family, people who had known Harry his entire life, finding it increasingly difficult to maintain closeness with someone whose private conversations ended up in published books. How does it feel, Helen asked, to have published your family's private communications, their exact words, their intimate moments, in a book you sold for millions? How would you feel if someone did that to you? Harry called the framing unfair. Helen didn't reach for an argument. She reached for a principle. Privacy is not selective. You cannot demand it for yourself, and you have demanded it, loudly and repeatedly, while removing it from others. Your father, your brother, your stepmother, your grandmother, even in death. You've written about all of them, sold all of them, profited from all of them. That's not speaking your truth, that's commerce. A second time, that word, commerce, because it was that word, appearing again with the deliberateness of a hammer, that defined the entire argument. The press treats everyone badly. Diana, Camilla, Kate. The treatment wasn't unique to you. What was unique was what you did with it. The Oprah interview wasn't free. The Netflix deal wasn't charity. The book earned millions. You have monetized your grievances more successfully than anyone in royal history. That's not honesty. That's commerce. And into the silence that followed, Harry said something that would be replayed on every news program in Britain by the following morning. I just wanted to protect my family. Helen paused, and when she spoke, her voice carried something that was almost sadness. Protecting your family does not require a Netflix camera crew. It does not require an Oprah interview. It does not require a 400-page memoir. Protection and publication are not the same thing. If what you wanted was protection, you could have had it in silence. The question nobody asked, and the one that broke through. Graham, at this point, had long surrendered any control over the conversation. He sat with his cards untouched, his expression the particular mixture of fascination and alarm you see on the face of someone watching a controlled explosion from a safe distance. Helen asked to continue. I want to ask you something personal, and I ask it not to be unkind, but because I think it's the question underneath all the others. Harry waited. Do you believe you are wanted? By the royal family? By the British public? By the American establishment that has not, despite everything, fully embraced you? Who wants you? Not your content, not your story, not the drama you generate. Who actually wants you present in their life? Invited, included, missed when absent. The silence that followed was the longest of the entire evening. Ask yourself honestly, what would you say? If you were sitting in front of a live audience and an 80-year-old woman with nothing left to prove asked you that question with the quiet certainty that she already knew the answer, What would you say? Harry said his wife wanted him. His children. Helen nodded slowly. Your family. Yes, though there are reports, from people close to both of you, that Harry increasingly attends events alone, that there is a gravitational pull back toward England that complicates your household. I won't speculate about your marriage, but is your wife's desire to have you present the same as being wanted? By a community, by a country, by the family you came from? Harry said he had millions of supporters. Millions who consume your content, Helen said. That's not the same as being wanted. That's being watched, consumed. Millions watch car crashes. Being wanted means being invited, being included, being missed when absent, when you don't show up, and who calls? Who feels the absence? The answer Harry gave was halting, incomplete. And the incompleteness of it, that gap where a full, confident answer should have lived, was its own kind of answer. The breaking point and the exit. And then came the final exchange, the one that closed the argument entirely. Harry said something that, in retrospect, was the most self-defeating thing he could possibly have said in that moment. He said that he found it difficult to take criticism from someone who had profited from his family's story. Helen smiled, not with triumph, with something quieter than that, something that looked almost like pity. I played your grandmother because I respected her enough to study her, because I believed she was worth understanding, because I saw in her something genuinely admirable, a woman who received nothing she didn't earn and gave everything the role demanded. She paused. One beat. What I see in you is a man who received everything: title, platform, protection, opportunity, global recognition, and spent the years since calculating how to maximize the return on leaving it all behind. That's not courage. That's not sacrifice. That's strategy. And it has worked, financially. But it hasn't bought you what you actually want. And what you actually want, to be loved, to be included, to be wanted, cannot be purchased with a Netflix deal. The studio was completely silent. Harry stood, straightened his jacket. He said, "And remember this line, because it reveals everything. I didn't come here to be attacked." Helen looked at him with that same steady calm that had not moved throughout the entire conversation. "You came here to discuss your work and your story. I discussed your work and your story. What I offered was not attack. It was examination. The difference between attack and examination is whether the questions have answers. An attack doesn't need answers. An examination does. You didn't provide them." Harry left. The studio door closed, and the red sofa sat in the particular silence of a room full of people who have just witnessed something they do not quite have words for yet. Graham Norton stared at his cards, at the remaining guests, at the audience. "Well," he said, "that just happened." Helen's final statement, and the words that circled the globe. Helen smoothed her sleeve, composed, settled, the kind of stillness that isn't performed. It's accumulated. 50 years of difficult rooms, difficult directors, difficult questions. This was not the hardest thing she had navigated. It just happened to be in front of cameras. She asked to say one more thing, directly to camera, directly to the people watching at home. Graham nodded. Nobody in that studio was going to stop her. She said, "I was raised anti-monarchist. My parents would have been deeply uncomfortable with everything I spent my career doing. But through studying Elizabeth II, through genuinely trying to understand her rather than simply judging her, I came to respect something I had dismissed: the weight of duty, the daily discipline of putting something larger than yourself ahead of your own preferences, the quiet endurance of a woman who gave her life to service without ever once asking for credit." The studio was completely silent, not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a punchline. The deep, genuine silence of people who have just heard something true. What I witnessed tonight was the opposite of that. Someone who received extraordinary gifts from an institution, recognition, platform, global fame, financial security, a title that opens every door, and has spent the years since those gifts were given cataloging how badly they were wrapped. That is not courage. That is not honesty. And somebody who has earned the right to say so, needed to say it. The applause came slowly. Not the explosive energy of entertainment, The heavy, considered applause of people who have been through something and are only now beginning to understand what it was. A musician on the sofa, silent all evening, said quietly, "My grandmother watched the Queen every Christmas. She'd be glad someone defended her." Helen said, "That's who I was thinking of. The people who loved her, who saw something worth admiring, who have watched that legacy get dismantled for profit and felt helpless to respond." She looked directly at the camera. "I responded for them." Aftermath. What happened when the credits rolled? The BBC aired the footage that night without a single edit. Not a cut, not a softened moment, not a diplomatic trim. What the studio audience witnessed, the nation witnessed in full. By morning, the clips had reached every corner of the internet, not just in Britain, globally. The phrases that spread fastest were not philosophical. They were the simple surgical lines. Strip away the royal connection, and what remains? You earned your title through birth. She earned hers through work. Protection and publication are not the same thing. You've monetized your grievances more successfully than anyone in royal history. That's not honesty. That's commerce. Harry's team released a statement describing the appearance as a premeditated ambush, coordinated, institutionally motivated, designed to humiliate. Helen's response, delivered through her representatives, was 3 sentences. Coordinated? I spoke from decades of study and honest observation. The ambush he describes is simply an 80-year-old woman asking questions he couldn't answer. And then she added one final line, the line that was shared as widely as anything from the broadcast itself. I've played the Queen. I've met the Queen. I've studied the Queen. When someone attacks that legacy while continuing to benefit from it, I notice. And at 80 years old, I have absolutely nothing to lose by noticing out loud. Nothing to lose! That is the phrase that explains everything about why Helen Mirren was able to do what no interviewer, no journalist, no family member had managed to do in years of trying. She had no brand to protect beyond the one she'd already built across 5 decades of documented work. No career trajectory to worry about. No algorithm to satisfy. No deal to protect. No platform built on someone else's legacy that she needed to defend. Just an Oscar. A damehood. 50 years of earned authority. And the particular freedom of someone who has already proven everything she needs to prove and has nothing left to lose by speaking plainly. When someone like that decides to speak, you hear it differently. It carries a weight that no PR statement can manufacture. The gravity of someone who has chosen their battles carefully across an entire lifetime and has finally chosen one worth fighting. What the red sofa actually revealed. So what did that red sofa actually show us on that Friday night? It showed us the difference between earned authority and assumed authority, between a title that arrives after 50 years of documented contribution and a title that arrives through the circumstances of birth and marriage, between someone who studied an institution because she respected it and someone who inhabited that institution briefly and left with it packaged as content. Helen asked what Harry had built independently. He couldn't answer. Helen asked if Harry was wanted anywhere, by his family, his country, the American establishment that has still not fully embraced him. He couldn't answer. Helen asked what protection required that publication could provide. He couldn't answer. And in that silence, that devastating, impossible-to-ignore silence where answers should have lived, the contrast between the two people on that sofa became undeniable. Not because Helen was cruel. She was never cruel. Not once across that entire conversation did she raise her voice, reach for personal insult, or move beyond the specific, documented, factual territory of what Harry had said and done publicly. Everything she challenged was on the record. Every question she asked was answerable, if the answer existed. The silence wasn't Helen's doing. The silence was the absence of answers to honest questions. Some people spend their entire lives earning their place. They take the hard roles and the unglamorous years. They do the work that nobody watches. They study what they don't yet understand, because they believe understanding matters. They build something real, slowly, year by year, brick by brick. And the authority that comes from that process, the kind that lets an 80-year-old woman sit perfectly still while a duke walks off the set, cannot be purchased, inherited, or manufactured. Helen Mirren is that person. And what that red sofa revealed, in 6 minutes of television that Britain will not quickly forget, is what happens when earned authority meets assumed authority. What happens when someone who has done the work finally has the conversation with someone who hasn't. What happens when the questions are honest and the answers don't come. The audience watched it happen in real time. Britain watched it that night. The world watched it by morning. Helen earned everything on that sofa. The silence told the rest of the story.